Hey everyone,
How you doing?
I'm doing good.
I'm not everyone, but anyway, go ahead.
This is Dr. Russ Jones.
Brad Kennan here.
We are wide open.
So how you doing tonight, Russ?
I'm doing good.
All right.
Rainy here today. Couldn't get in the woods. Bummed about that. I don't think Bigfoot does much when it rains. So, I figure, if he's not doing much, I'm not doing much. And give it a couple more days. Maybe he'll leave me a track.
And every time I've been in the woods trying to look for Bigfoot in the rain, I can never hear anything. It's awful. It's miserable. And I simply quit doing it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. Hey, so I got a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
You and I talk about this all the time.
Yep.
And I think we've even talked about it on the show before, but
Yep.
I correct me if I'm wrong, but tonight I want to get into, or we want to get into whether or not the government has a conspiracy, whether the government tries to keep people from knowing about Bigfoot, if there's evidence of Bigfoot. Am I correct in saying that you think that there is evidence of that?
I absolutely do. And I'm going to tell you why.
Okay. Tell me why.
So I got a couple examples. I know someone that was personally friends with a gentleman that supposedly shot a baby Bigfoot out west. He got blood on his boots. Boots went in the freezer. Supposedly sent those off for DNA. The email chain said, hey, it's kind of this unknown primate. We don't really know, blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden the email comes back and says, oh, it was a bear. And the guy says, well, I want my samples back. And they said, we lost them. Number one. So that tells me. And number two, there's this thing out there called Ancestry.com, or what's the one, 23andMe, or whatever that is. So I know for a fact that they suppress Native American DNA in those results. Period.
How do you know that?
I know that for a fact because my great grandmother's father was a Cherokee Indian. Straight up.
Okay, wait a second. Let me think about this. Your great grandmother's father.
Yes. And then my wife's grandmother, if you looked at her, she looks like a straight Indian, and she was from Kentucky, and there's Indian bloods in her line, and neither one of us came back with Indian blood. Period.
So why would they suppress that?
Because they're suppressing that because everybody that has Indian blood is going to go to the tribe and say, hey, I need money because you guys have got a casino. I want to have a casino too. I want part of that money. So the government and the Native Americans, they got together and they said, hey, we're going to suppress that data to the general population so nobody can come to you and ask you for that information. In exchange, if that person wants to be, thought of by the tribe or that organization, they have to actually go through the tribe and go through the records and do all that kind of stuff. So here we know for a fact that probably the CIA, the FBI, the federal government is the ones behind that database of us. I mean, it has to be. I think it's been proven that, how dumb are we to go swab our own DNA and send it in, and so everybody has a DNA fingerprint of us. So who's to say that same government, as soon as they get that swab of DNA, they know it's a Squatch, they go out and contact whoever has that evidence, they have a stern conversation with it, because most of them are going to be medical organizations or research organizations, and they're all getting funded by the federal government. They're all getting federal dollars and research dollars. And all you have to do is say, hey, if you continue down this path, we're going to cut your money. Period. That's my belief.
Okay. So, I believe, based on my 240,000 patient visits, literally, that I've had in the last 31 years, that people cannot keep a secret, and that they would have to share with someone or their doctor, because people tell me everything that you'd be horrified to know what people tell me when they get in that room and they know that I can't share it with anyone.
Right.
I think that there's individuals inside the government that know that. My argument would be today, we're always spending an hour or two before we go on. researching the topic, what may be out there. It's shocking the number of park rangers, dozens and dozens and dozens of them that come out usually after they retire and tell their Bigfoot story, but they don't tell it while they're in there. So I think that there may be a systemic thing that we don't want to put this out there, but I think that individuals are the ones that have the control over it, and they probably couldn't keep it secret.
I disagree, because I think that it literally takes a simple piece of programming when that genome hits that genetic database and it matches that squatch, that someone could be alerted and they send somebody out.
Since we've started, you always want to put your tinfoil hat on, and you talk about it, and you always want to do it. So tonight is your first chance,
correct,
to reach out there, and really do that.
Right. So we're going to go ahead and bring him on, Micah Hanks from MicahHanks.com. And I'm sure you have plenty of, what's your podcast?
Gosh, well, there's a lot of them. I mean, my
Right.
flagship is the Micah Hanks program, but I have a special show that's all about Sasquatch. Russ, of course, the good doctor, has been a guest in the past, and that's Sasquatch Tracks, where we, try to approach that subject scientifically. I try to approach all these sorts of subjects, things that the mainstream generally won't, deal with. I try to approach those with logic, reason, and a scientific mindset. And where warranted, sometimes we do dip a toe into conspiracy, because I think that, and I'll just briefly say this, conspiracy theory has been kind of a weaponized term. It's often very politically charged, and maybe there are good reasons for that in many instances, especially in recent years. But I mean, we can also recognize that conspiracy theory as a term really only refers to the theory that there is a conspiracy, two or more individuals operating together, usually unbeknownst to a third party who they're operating against, in collusion. And so, conspiracy theories, from time to time are actually proven later to be conspiracy facts. Conspiracies certainly happen. And so just etymologically and otherwise, if we just recognize what those terms mean, sometimes they're valid. And so when I say, let's talk about a conspiracy, as we will probably discuss a little bit tonight, I'm not trying to throw out, I don't think that appealing to conspiracy theory necessarily strengthens an argument, but where warranted, we should recognize that they do happen, and there's historical precedent for them. And I happen to feel the same about Sasquatch, too. I think that there's historical precedent that's often overlooked by academic researchers for the existence of relics, hominoids, as I prefer to call them. And so I hope we'll get into a lot of all of this discussion about our mutual interests. But good to be here, guys.
It's good to have you, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we'll get right into it, because I just like to get right into the facts. And people are driving to work and they got about a 25-minute drive. So we need to get them 25 minutes into work and 25 minutes coming home. That's where they're going to listen to this. So my belief is that there is a systemic conspiracy out there by the federal government to not divulge this information. And number one, I always go to the spotted owl. The spotted owl in Oregon literally bankrupted 2 counties. I think I looked up this one time. I think what is the timber industry is about a $16 billion a year industry or something of that sort. I don't know. It's quite large. But I think just the spotted owl cost, man, I can't remember the number. It was some giant number of jobs. If it was proven that Sasquatch existed, I could not go into a forest. I could not go into private land. I could not go anywhere and cut a tree down, period, because that's habitat. I couldn't do it. And number 2 is, our national parks, they're a huge draw for this country. And, you have to pay money to get in, you have to pay money to get out. Somebody brought up, I can't remember, somebody I was talking to the other day about, we used to have to pay to get in. Now we have to pay to get in. So they have to maintain those parks, but they're also keeping track of people going in, coming out, things like that. If people knew that there was an 8-foot, 9-foot, 800-pound bipedal, relic hominid walking around out there that could pull your head off and rip your arms off and beat you with them, they're not going to go in the woods. So that's my theory. So,
well, just to weigh in on that a little bit there, Brad, it's certainly possible. And I will say this. If the government were to come across information that indicated that there was actually a biological reality to Sasquatch, they recognized this, and even if it was fairly geographically constrained, let's say that they only thought it was like the Pacific Northwest.
Sure.
And they thought, okay, well, there is a public safety hazard here, but not only on part. And if you think about, for instance, the ordinances that were passed in Skamania County, Washington, where they actually did pass legislation with regard to killing Bigfoot, even though the fact that legislation years ago, decades in fact, was passed on April 1st, that probably kind of gives us an idea of what the intention behind that was. But nonetheless, those are actually laws in that state, however seriously or not those lawmakers may have taken it. And the concern, I've actually seen some commentators refer to that as a brilliant law, because in essence, what they have done is, rather than protect Sasquatch, they have prevented people from lawfully, by virtue of there being no law to protect the Sasquatch, being able to go out and hunt Sasquatch and thereby endanger the public by the potential misuse of firearms in that instance.
Right. So just for people that may not know what we're talking about, at some point they passed this law, correct, that said basically killing and hunting a Sasquatch is illegal, and it's on the books. So either, they're recognizing that there's a Sasquatch there, which, like you said, April 1st is kind of a joke, tongue in cheek, whatever that is. But technically there's something on the book. So for the people, there's a lot of people that may not be Sasquatch, enthusiasts like us. That's what it is. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
No, thank you for clarifying that. Again, that's an important point. Now, the reason I bring that up is because, again, in those instances, it's unlikely to me that the government was trying to actually protect a species.
No, I agree with you.
And I would further say that in most instances, based on my own research, and I'll get into a bit about what that research entails here in a moment, but based on my research over the last few years, I have seen very little indication that the government is actively trying to cover something up. But to your point, if it were ever revealed, or if it were ever learned and the broader public didn't know that Sasquatch existed, but there was the one concern about what hunters or people who might be thrill seekers might do, two, concern about public safety with relation to actual encounters with the creature and what it might do to individuals, all these factors taken into consideration. Three, you mentioned like logging and habitat. What would happen to industry, U.S. Forest Service lands and things like this, where these creatures are believed to use, or exist for habitation? Would there be implications in terms of government that would be required changes implemented to protect a new species or to account for its presence otherwise? Absolutely. There would inevitably have to be some sorts of changes. And so, in my view, most officials I've spoken with, and a majority of them is, Russ, you've been alluding to Department of Interior employees, National Park Service and things like that. That's a logical place to begin a search for this kind of research, subject and people who've had encounters with it. If there are those who are sympathetic to it, they are in the minority. Most people seem to treat this like it's water cooler, like it's just a joke. And I go about it very seriously. And so the responses I've received don't convey to me a cover-up or a conspiracy theory, but I could absolutely see some instances why that might be the result if the creature were ever acknowledged without a public revelation of that acknowledgement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I look back at marijuana. So hemp, basically years and years and years ago, hemp was coming out and it's going to be this great thing, and we're going to make hemp paper, and we're going to make hemp this and hemp that and rope and all these things. Well, Hearst was a giant at the time with Hearst Publishing, and he still is. His family's very, very, they're billionaires or whatever it is. And he said, you know what? Hemp is going to impact my business as a lumber person.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and I'm going to say that marijuana causes, men to rape women and all these things in the lower class, and I'm going to get it made illegal, which he did through legislation, and he put a bunch of money behind it. And he got the laws changed. So, technically he saw that impacting his business. and he changed the law, which with this, I could see the same thing happening. You know, these guys, Weyerhaeuser Paper and these giant corporations, General GP, Georgia Pacific, these giant paper mills and these giant wood companies, they're just saying, hey, you know, we have lobbyists, we have stuff. You got to keep this quiet, guys. You have to. If it's real or not, we don't want to know. Here's a bunch of money. So
Mike, let me ask you, I heard you say that what they have told you. So does that mean that you have actually interviewed people or that you've done Freedom of Information Acts, or how do you exactly have you went about that?
Yeah, that's precisely right, Russ. So the multi-tiered approach that I've taken involves reaching out to the public relations specialists at various national parks, for instance, but also this extends to military and other branches of government. I've also done historical research with regard to people who, like you'd mentioned earlier, National Park Service employees maybe who have come out and who have talked about their experiences only after the fact. And it's not, you know, exclusive to National Park. There's a lot of that. But I mean, again, I actually come across quite a bit of information, which, again, these are anecdotal reports, but they're very interesting reports involving nighttime military training operations. And I'll share one that really almost kind of launched all this here in a second. That's one approach. Yes, Freedom of Information Act is another. I very frequently employ the Freedom of Information Act to file requests related to information that I've attempted to obtain from especially U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Department of the Interior, which includes, you know, National Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I believe. So there are all these different agencies that I've gone to, U.S. military, SOCOM, even Air Force, because there have been sightings of these things near Air Force bases and things along those lines. So through that approach, the sad thing is, you know, you get the least amount of information probably through the FOIA process, although I have actually gotten some interesting documentation. In recent days, for example, I was able to get a very lengthy file from California Fish and Wildlife that they've kept since the 1970s on Sasquatch. Now, when you read that file, it's evident that the people who've been keeping the file there, and this being a state agency, so this isn't technically FOIA, this is something that's called Public or Open Records Act, depending on the state. Each individual state has its own Public Records Act or Open Records request process, where sometimes only people who live in that state can make those requests, but most states allow any U.S. citizen to file a request in another state and they can get that information. And indeed, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has a fantastic little collection of documents they've kept for several decades. But in the correspondences and things you see in that batch of documents, you can tell that they don't take this subject seriously. Their explicit policy is, you know, we don't consider this, they term Sasquatch a phenomena. They don't consider it something that is scientific or a subject of scientific inquiry. And yet, nonetheless, they kept documentation on that, which I found interesting. And I'm not really sure why that would be the case.
So when they call it phenomena, so are they saying it's a misidentification of a bear or something like that? And that's the phenomena that's occurring?
Or it's cultural.
Or it's culture. Okay.
I would say it's probably that their interpretation is that it's cultural. And, you know, researcher David Paulides did an interview with Eric Loft, who worked with that department a few years ago. And Eric Loft, at that time during that interview that Paulides did with him, also termed it as a phenomenon. Interestingly, there's information in correspondences featured now in that file since I've obtained it, where they refer to that interview and other things, and they say we term it a phenomena. So my interpretation is they don't see Sasquatch as being a biological reality that they study as a creature, but they recognize the interest in the subject and they group that culturally, I guess, as being a phenomenon. But nonetheless, these are government records that were kept, you know, files on a subject that is generally deemed to be either, you know, hearsay nonsense or extraordinary by most, and yet they're keeping these files and they've kept them for decades. That to me is pretty interesting. And through the Public Record Act and FOIA request process, I have, you know, obtained some interesting data, but the majority of it, and this comes back to something Russ had been talking about, the majority of subject matter of interest to me is testimony by federal employees, you know, employees of the United States federal government who have had firsthand encounters And if you like, we could get into a few of those.
Absolutely. People
Sure,
love
I'd love
stories.
to hear that.
Because I have a couple stories too that I've heard, and see if it's the same story. So go ahead.
Sure. You know, for instance, of course, everyone here and you guys especially are familiar with the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, but through their website, there was an interview that was posted. It hadn't been conducted initially through a BFRO researcher. I think this was an interview that was just posted on the website with Bob Jackson, a former Yellowstone Park backcountry ranger of many years. He was a seasonal ranger. And by backcountry, where he was patrolling was
is that Action Jackson, Russ? Is that
the one and only?
Right.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, Action Jackson. Bob Jackson patrolling the thoroughfare. Again, for those who aren't familiar with this, again, Yellowstone, that's been a central focus of research of mine too. Really, Jackson's account is pretty well known, but it led to a lot of other inquiries, and I've come across several similar accounts now from Yellowstone. But the thoroughfare in that park is essentially the tract of land in the contiguous 48 where you can get furthest from any road anywhere in the U.S. And although it's no longer the largest national park in the United States, Yellowstone is one of the largest in the contiguous 48, and it's also the oldest. And so the backcountry rangers who patrol the thoroughfare on horseback are in a unique situation because, one, there's not motor noise. They're out there, they're able to make less noise. They're sometimes miles and miles and miles away from roads. And many of them have told stories about encounters like Bob did. So his story, of course, which you can find on the BFRO website, he had been leading, I believe, a tour on horseback, and he was coming up on an alpine meadow, and his horse starts reacting as though a grizzly bear were nearby. And anybody here who's encountered here on the East Coast, it's mostly black bears for us guys, but
yeah,
I've encountered a lot of bear in the forest myself. And black bear usually aren't going to be a problem. Grizzlies, they're a little more temperamental. And so when his horse began to react to the situation, Jackson took note, and he looks down into this glade, and he sees a deer standing at the edge of a thicket, which shoots off. And he expects to see a grizzly come out the other side, and instead he sees an object, or a being, an individual walking on or running actually on two legs. He says that the arms didn't bend at the elbows like ours do, but were more or less straight, but they swung, and that this creature ran from position of concealment to position of concealment in a diagonal fashion, which he said was interesting because grizzlies, he said, they're going to go in a straight line to try and get away from you. This thing was obviously intelligent and was trying to remain hidden. Now, when I see people like Bob Jackson, who have everything to lose from coming out and talking about stories like this, that one gave me cause for pause, but then I came to learn that there are plenty of other Yellowstone rangers who've had similar experiences. Orville Butch Bach, who wrote a book about his reflections as a seasonal ranger at Yellowstone, he also had an experience where he heard a vocalization, he and three other individuals camping in the thoroughfare. They described this as being similar to a crazed Tarzan scream, and he'd interviewed someone else, several people actually, but one particular friend of his, and he'd been a skeptic at the time. This guy described something remarkably similar to what Bob Jackson did. And so there are a lot of these kinds of stories that led me to reach out to the park. And so my first, thrust of the investigation was to reach out to the, first I filed a FOIA request, but didn't get anything. Yellowstone Park responded politely and said, we need you to be more specific. And I'm thinking, how much more specific can you be than Bigfoot?
Right.
But, in truth, with the FOIA process, and this warrants a brief mention, for that to work, agencies, especially in the internet era, they are just inundated with requests at this point. And so these agencies, even back in the day when people were still doing this by mail or through fax machines, would tell you, for us to replicate these and copy these documents and send them to you, will take man hour, and then there are the printing costs. So if you send us a request like, give us all your UFO files.
Right.
Yeah, okay, well, maybe we've got 1,000 of those files, but the time it will take us to dig all that up and to print it, you're going to have to pay for it. And they do charge in many instances. Where you don't get charged for a FOIA request is if the cost of printing the materials they could send to you is more expensive than the fee that they would request for the service that they provide. And so in essence, usually if it's less expensive for them just to, dig it up and send you digital files, they'll send you stuff. And in most instances, you don't have to pay for those FOIAs. Now, that said, if you are very vague in a request and just say Sasquatch or Bigfoot, they're going to say, look, sometimes they'll humor you. But most often the response you'll get is, we need you to be more specific. Can you give us a date range that you want us to look for Sasquatch reports in? Although the initial FOIA requests, as I had anticipated, were unsuccessful, but I went ahead and filed that anyway as an introductory FOIA to see what the response might be. I then began to narrow the focus. I also reached out to the public relations office there at Yellowstone, and they got back with me within hours. But my questions were this: as unlikely as it may seem, if a creature like Sasquatch were confirmed to exist in the park, what would the National Park Service and or Yellowstone Park's position on the existence of that creature? What would their position be, and how would you guys react to it if the creature were found there? And they responded and said, we have no confirmed sightings of the creature in the park, and therefore we have no position on what our feelings toward it or reaction would be. Now, the interesting thing is, if we read into that a little bit, when we're talking about tracking animals, as rangers and park personnel, wildlife biologists would do, a confirmed sighting, and we probably talked a little bit about this when you were on our program, but I mean, a confirmed sighting would be where you have data like spoor, you have DNA maybe from animal predation, you have game cam footages that unambiguously show, for instance, a cougar or another animal or wolf, and that could be considered a confirmed sighting. When we come to Sasquatch, we don't have a type specimen that we know of, right? Although there are stories, but we don't have any kind of type specimen that scientists have access to, by which we can compare remains, DNA, or even footprints. And therefore, it would be very difficult to argue that a confirmed sighting could occur. So I don't think that Yellowstone was lying at all when they said we have no confirmed sightings. But that doesn't preclude the possibility that people do see things that they can't identify in Yellowstone Park.
Well, that's what Brad's going to say instantly. As soon as you say that, he's going to jump on there and say,
right.
They've given themselves an out.
Well, maybe they have, because, again, I took the time to try and better understand the definition for my own needs of, what a confirmed sighting is. And so
maybe you should ask for reports of bipedal bears.
I have.
Okay. All right.
Often when I file FOIA requests, I'll say any sightings involving possible bears seen walking upright. I mean, I do everything except say Bigfoot or Sasquatch in many instances. But as helpful as the National Park Service especially will tend to be with those FOIA requests, they will tend to get back and say, we're not really sure what you're asking about. And I'm thinking,
so let's say a park ranger takes a report. Somebody sees this bipedal bear, Sasquatch walking. I saw it. I see a ranger right up the road. I go up to the ranger and say, Ranger, you won't believe this. I just saw a Sasquatch. And the ranger goes, great, let's fill out the report. So they take 5 minutes. They fill out the report. It was this location, this time, but here's your name. He takes that report, walks into a supervisor's, hand sits on their desk. That supervisor looks at it and says, this could create an issue. Shredder.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's not an improbable scenario, if you ask me. Now, something else that reminds me of another interesting case. I have gotten one actual on actual National Park Service paper, a actual report, an incident report that was filled out at Olympic Park by a ranger. And this one's also out in the wild. I've seen a few people reference this. Matt Pruitt and I have talked about it. It involved an incident back in, I think, 1993, where a group of people observed what sounds very much like a Sasquatch. The only thing that's a little strange about the report is that some of the witnesses thought that there was like a bushy tail-like appendage, but not all of the observers thought that there was a tail on this creature. I tracked down because in accordance with the FOIA process, they usually redact the names of any individuals who are mentioned. In this instance, they didn't redact the name of the Park Service employees who were listed, including the park ranger who filed the report. And I tracked her down, and she confirmed, yes, I filed that report. And she said, I know of other people who've had similar encounters up there near where that incident occurred. That's something I've really found to be very useful, even in instances where a FOIA request comes back in the positive, and I actually get a documented report like that one in 1993 at Olympic National Park. Sometimes the better data comes from people I'm able to locate or track down as a result of that request. A great example at Crater Lake National Park, we have the Smith brothers, Wayne and Larry, and Larry and Lloyd Smith, who have meticulously collected the historical information about that park and published an amateur historical account, a history of Crater Lake National Park. And in that, there are at least 3 entries that refer to Sasquatch sightings. One that was a possible sighting where 2 rangers had pine cones thrown at them. One where a motorist from California passing through the park saw a daytime, observation of a road crossing. And then another road crossing, but this one was really interesting to me because it was reported in 1975, I believe, by the park naturalist at that time, George Morrison. So I filed FOIA requests trying to see if there was an incident report because in my view, I thought, the park naturalist, if he saw a Sasquatch,
he's got to write something down, right?
Probably, yes, that's exactly, Brad, what I thought. I'm thinking, there must have been a report.
It's a gold mine, man, right here. We just got it. Smoking gun.
So, and that's what I thought, and it was referenced even in the Smith Brothers chronological history. So I filed a FOIA. I ended up actually getting in touch with Larry and Lloyd at one point because I wrote a brief article about this online. They were thrilled to see that their history had been written about and even said, we got to meet if you come out here to Oregon. But I told them, I said, I filed a FOIA request trying to get information about George Morrison's sighting. And I was told that they had no records responsive to my request because the period of 40 years, each different park and sometimes even each different agency has a different retention period that documentation will be kept. And they said, that was more than 40 years ago. That's our retention period. So we wouldn't have anything. And I thought, shoot. Yeah. But I tell Larry and Lloyd, and they said, oh, well, we're still in touch with George. Heck, he lives in, I won't say where he lives now, but, because he lives in another state and he's a private citizen. But they said, we'll send you his email. So George emailed me and was just a delight. And yet again, in this instance, what I was trying to get through FOIA and couldn't find, George sent me not only his personal sighting, but he said after I had my sighting, lots of other people came to me. There was a snowblower operator there in the park who said that he observed 2 upright walking bears, or so he thought, which it was evident to him as he watched them walk on 2 legs. These were animals I had never seen before. That was shortly before Morrison's sighting. There was also a incident at a nearby town where there were footprints left in snow that had walked all through a neighborhood, this small little community there in Oregon. The footprints would lead up to the back of chicken shacks in the neighborhood. And it seemed that something had been trying to get into these chicken shacks. But he said that there were clear, unambiguous, human-like large bear footprints left in fresh snow. The photographs had been taken by Park Service employees. They were laid out on a table, and I drove over there to take a look at them. And he told other similar stories to that. But one thing that stuck out in my mind was, in addition to his own sighting, which was just a fleeting, sighting of something walk across the road. And as the naturalist in the park, George said, I'm certain I hadn't been looking at an elk. This was not a bear. Whatever this was bipedal and moving. It was covered in hair and it moved across the road. But he said, you mentioned to me that you'd filed a FOIA request. And he said, no, I wonder why you did that, because he said, it never even occurred to me to file a report. Oh. He said to me, this was my personal sighting, and I didn't think anybody else would find it interesting. And it never even occurred to me to file any kind of official report.
Well, but at least you tracked him down, and he could give you the report verbally.
Right, yeah.
Michael, let me ask you this question.
Sure.
So is there evidence that, for instance, I was thinking about 1975, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers put out that brochure. I think it was an atlas for Washington, if I remember right, about how the animals that someone may encounter. And I remember that it cost a couple $100,000 to do it. And of course it had Bigfoot on it. Is there instances where the government has came out and said, or produced something like that, you would make it more believable that the government actually knew something?
And you're referring to an environmental atlas that I think was produced by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. It had the various fauna of every state, and they included in Washington Sasquatch, which was rather interesting. I would, yet again, in that instance, chalk that up to the attention that the subject was getting, especially at that time back in the 1970s. I recall researcher Peter Byrne featuring a print of that in the back of his book, Bigfoot, Man, Myth, or Monster, The Search for Bigfoot. And, again, I don't think that that's necessarily soft disclosure, but you do occasionally find references to Bigfoot in government documentation, for instance. And again, like I mentioned, this is not limited. My research is not limited to the Department of Interior, but there is an awful lot of information that comes from that agency and also the Department of Agriculture, just because of the relevance to forestry and national wildlife, protected wilderness areas, wildlife, and what have you. So there was a Department of Interior memorandum that was published back in the 1970s. Again, this one available online. And it was actually a release that was titled, what if we found Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, I think was the title, the name. And it was all hypothetical. But what they were saying was, is the government prepared for such a discovery? I mean, it's not impossible. I think they referenced the coelacanth and the discovery of similar living fossils and things like this. And they say it's not impossible. It's not without historical precedent that a new animal species could be discovered. And if it were, what would be the response from National Park Service? And what would be the response from the Bureau of Land Management and all these different agencies? And although it's hypothetical, it really was an interesting article because it gets into a lot of what we've already kind of touched on. They said, we would have to protect the public from the sudden swell in interest. There would be safety hazards, maybe not even related to these animals, but people's responses to them. There could be mass panic. Well, and I've seen, go ahead, Brad.
Well, you think about back in the 40s and 50s, I do believe the CIA got with Hollywood and they produced, it's proven that they produced a bunch of these, scripts and movies and funded a lot of stuff for aliens, right?
Oh, sure.
So Harry and the Henderson comes out in, the early 90s or whenever that was. And, Harry's this nice, friendly, I'm in the house, I'm eating stuff out of your refrigerator. We're driving in the car together. So
sandwiches and all that.
Right. Exactly. So, the desensitization of the public to the possibility that Bigfoot exists. And, there's all these different movies out there and stuff. So who's to say the government's not behind that? That's, part of their thing at that point in time.
Well, and Harry and the Hendersons, of course, one of my favorite films when I was a kid. I mean, I watched it over and over again. And even at that young age, I knew that, some of the characters were based on John Green and Renee Day Hendon, and always enjoyed that film. But yes, it paints a very loving, child-friendly, family-friendly image of Sasquatch. I think that really, in terms of how Sasquatch is likely to behave, if we look at historical accounts and we look at some indigenous American traditional beliefs associated with these creatures, there are a lot of accounts of kidnappings. If we go back to Elkanah Walker in 1840, he's talking about the Spokane, and he says, allow me to tell you of some of their superstitions. But he talks about these giants on some mountain off to the west. You guys are very, familiar with that account, no doubt. But at that time, he also describes them, according to the Spokane tradition, as men stealers. And if anything, to me, what it sounds an awful lot like is that relic hominoids, if they exist, and I do think based on the testimony of these Park Service employees, certain members of the military who claim to have had nighttime encounters. I'll get to one of those in a second, as I promised. And others, federal government employees who say that they have seen these creatures and had experiences with them. That to me is a strong argument even though it's anecdotal, it's not physical evidence that would, satisfy a chemist or a physicist or a material scientist. But if we can, and this argument's often made, and I know skeptics take an issue with it, but if we can put a person away for life based on testimony provided in a court of law, we are making a step toward recognizing the reality of Sasquatch by establishing its historical provenance and also finding authoritative witnesses, unimpeachable witnesses, and source material, i.e. information from government, which helps to establish its credible provenance. Now, let me step out of Sasquatch for just a minute before we get over to that military encounter I was talking about. The work I do mostly, and Russ listens to some of my other podcasts, so he probably knows this, but I'm primarily involved in unidentified aerial phenomena research. And for the last several decades, but especially in recent years, there's been a tremendous amount, maybe a disproportionate amount of focus placed on the government's interest in this phenomena and data it's collecting on it. And interestingly, one of the byproducts of that focus has been a sort of, legitimization of that subject. Ever since 2017, it was revealed in the New York Times that there was a DoD effort. This was characterized as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program in the New York Times, but it was actually what was referenced in that article was a separate program, a predecessor called ALSAP. We won't get into the details about that right now. But the point is that the government certainly did have an interest in UAP. It still does. Widespread reporting on that led to increased public interest, and then shortly thereafter, scientists started kind of getting interested. Congressmen and women started legislating, and it began to become a situation where there was legislation that from Congress requiring the Pentagon not only to investigate this, but to do so in a certain way. And we now have the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office within the DoD that is now looking at this phenomenon. And so the reason I think it's important to look at the possibility that government agencies and personnel have either observed and or taken interest in and perhaps documented information about Sasquatch. First of all, I don't know very many researchers who are looking for this information, so you don't know if you don't look. But two, if you do find that information, might it help in the same way that UAP has benefited from serious government interest in this? So again, I think about military servicemen like one individual who reached out to me a number of years ago. He was stationed, I think, at Fort Polk, Louisiana in the 1970s. And the story he told is almost archetypal in the sense that after I heard this story, and this was personally related to me by this individual, but after I go online, I find so many similar stories to this one by other military personnel who were doing the same thing, nighttime military training operations. He said, I was out, we were doing one of these nighttime training operations in a very thick kind of a bayou kind of environment. There were 3 other personnel with me. We got separated from our company, and we knew that we were just going to head south until we reached this road that bisected the property, and we would hitch a ride back to the main gate. He said, while we were headed south through that thick forest on our way to that road, he said we were pursued at a distance by a large, shaggy, red-eyed animal that kept a distance from us, but he said we could smell the thing, and whatever it was, it followed us. We got out to the main road. We were all aware because we did have flashlights, and he said that occasionally we would see the eye shine from this thing. And he said when we finally walked up the road, he said it never accosted us or gave us any trouble, but when we got up the road and a vehicle, a pickup driver was coming along and everything, and he gave them a lift, the driver said, was there a 5th person with you guys further up the road? And they said, no, there wasn't. Did you see something? And he said, the driver of the vehicle, yeah, there was somebody, as I was coming down the road and I saw you guys, somebody else up the road stepped out of the light and back into the woods further up the road behind you guys, like they were following you at a distance. And so he said there was even a write-up in the local newspapers. And so that's another research effort, which is, digging through newspaper archives like newspapers.com, Library of Congress, trying to document these things, which again has proven to be incredibly beneficial with the research of Mark Mersell and his investigations into Ape Canyon. Yes. So again, historical documentation, but also historical records obtained through government sources and what we might call the unimpeachable witness. I don't know if there is such a thing, but I would certainly think that federal government employees, including trained military personnel during active training maneuvers who have encountered these creatures, that would have to be as close to being an unimpeachable witness as we might get, which I think will help establish the reality of this phenomenon.
I think that I remember a report, Russ, our friend Monongahela, didn't he take a report out on somewhere on the East Coast, Maryland, Virginia military base? They were doing
Virginia.
Is that where they were in the artillery? Yeah, and they and literally the transcript says Squatch on the range, ceasefire. The Squatches go across the artillery range, and once they're off the range, they start it up again. So,
and hence why I saw FOIAs to the military, but haven't gotten any responses.
Well, I mean, do you expect to get anything from them? Really?
I mean, by law, according to the Freedom of Information Act, they are supposed to at least acknowledge the request. And in some instances, I've filed requests to these agencies, and they don't even acknowledge receipt of the request. Now, sometimes things get lost in transmission, but I'll even go through the mail, and we'll still not get responses from certain agencies, which is troubling to me because that tells me one of two things. It's one of two things, and I'm going to be Switzerland on this, but it's either they are ignoring me because they think it's silly, or they are not responding for other reasons. Right.
Absolutely. And how easy it is for do that to say, oh, we're big government. It got lost because you're not squeaky enough. You're not big enough. I remember, when what's his name, Jeremy Corbell was on Rogan, and he's kind of pushed government and all this stuff with Bob Lazar for this stuff, and he's like, I've been in the government. He was a really squeaky wheel.
Yeah.
So he's getting some grease by the government, and until we're really, really squeaky about this, and we're citizen scientists. Russ got a job, you got a job, we all got jobs. I don't have a lot of time to just go back and create documentaries about the government's conspiracy behind Bigfoot. So we're not.
I know Jeremy Corbell, and I got to say this too. I like Jeremy a lot, and the result of him being that squeaky wheel ended up being that some of those officials, like for instance Commander Chad Underwood, who filmed the famous Tic Tac, he was the weapons systems operator on board an FA-18 Super Hornet that was in service to the USS Nimitz Carrier Group, Strike Group 11. And these people, I don't think would come forward if there weren't occasional squeaky wheels like that. So I commend Jeremy for the work he's done. He and I attended an aerospace conference related to UAP earlier this year, had a beer and talked a little about this. And again, if anything, if we've seen sort of a glass ceiling break with UFOs in recent years because of that kind of activity, that's what I would like to see happen with Sasquatch. But a question I have then is for the research community. You guys have been involved in the thick of it, like field research, even longer, much longer, in fact, than I have. And if we were ever to come to a kind of moment of clarity where it's like, okay, people are now taking this seriously, and they're coming to you guys as the experts, and they're saying, okay, well, we thought this was all nonsense, and now we know these things are out there. What do we do? How are we supposed to handle this? Will the research community be ready for that? Should we start preparing for that? Because I do think there's a biological reality to Sasquatch. I think that these federal employees who have seen these things, I don't think they're full of it. I don't think that they're cooking up wives' tales and strange stories. These sound like genuine, some of them at least, genuine observations of a biological organism that somehow is incredibly stealthy and has persistently remained out of our field of view for the most part. And yet the skeptic would say, well, if these things were all over the place, people would see them all the time. I think people do see them all the time, don't they?
Yeah, people do see them all the time. What about, you talked about, we have the Rangers, we have the military people. Are there other people in government that you're aware of that have had sightings? I know that there was years ago, there was a rumor that Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell had Bigfoot sightings. I don't know if there's anything to that or not, but are there other people that could be the squeaky wheel, so to speak, that is up there that have had sightings that you're aware of?
Yeah, and in fact, this year at Cryptid Con, I was there, and I gave a talk about this subject just a few weeks back. The morning of my talk, legendary Kentucky researcher Charlie Raymond, was there.
Yes.
Love Charlie.
Yeah, Charlie's just great. And he took me aside. I'd met Charlie a few times before this.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Yeah, and this story,
I actually had that written down on my paper to ask.
He's got the recording on his YouTube, I believe, of the conversation he had with this individual. But yeah, Charlie took me aside and he says, man, before you give your talk, you got a minute? And I said, yeah. And so we're having our coffee, and he reaches under the table. He says, you want some special creamer with your coffee? He had some sort of nice, like amaretto, with a little bit of, some sort of a liqueur in it and everything. So we're sitting there having this really super fancy, coffee and everything, and having this real serious conversation about this incident at Fort Knox. He's told this story on my podcast too. And, if anybody really wants the full story, I recommend you go and you look at Charlie's YouTube channel. But the story, in essence, is that this man had contacted him about one of the BFRO investigations that Charlie was going to be doing, and asked, is there a hospital nearby? It is revealed that, he was terminally ill, and he was inquiring about things. And he said, look, I'm going to be passing away in the near future, and I have no reason to hide this any longer, so I'm going to tell you the story. And he tells Charlie about an incident where a family essentially of these hominoids were shot down. They were gunned down during a military operation, presumably on the Fort Knox property. And Charlie kind of says, again, first of all, he said he was disturbed by it. And it is a disturbing story because the animals were perceived as a threat, and the individuals, the personnel involved, were given direct orders to shoot these things down. They were later taken, debriefed, given shots and all kinds of things thereafter. And there was a bit of a sort of a cover-up vibe. But, you know, Charlie's got the audio, and he said, thank goodness. He said, I happen to have this recorder going.
Yep.
And I recorded this guy's conversation and everything. And so he says, now that guy's long gone, but I've got that recording of that conversation. And one has to ask, I mean, now this is true. People do just tell stories sometimes. But what did this guy have to lose in making these kinds of claims?
Or what did he have to gain? He had nothing to gain.
He had nothing to gain at all. He had everything to lose.
Right, correct.
At the same time, you know, here we have one of these, you know, former government employees who comes out and says, you know, at this point they can't do anything to me, and I was always told to be quiet about it, but he says, I think you should know about this.
Right.
And you know, Charlie points out the fact that the incident occurred very close to an area where he works, by work, his field research in that part of Kentucky. And he says that, again, what that guy told me was consistent with other independent reports I have collected from that area in my own investigations. So stories like that are really interesting to me. And yeah, that's another example, I guess one might say, of people who've come forward. But now another example would be law enforcement. You know, in terms of state government, there are a lot of law enforcement professionals who also come forward, you know, having had their own encounters that you'll come across from time to time. I have found some pretty interesting ones from, you know, even in states like New York and things like that. I spoke with the sheriff who was the sheriff of the town there, Stacy, in that little town in Georgia where the famous road crossing video occurred.
The first Bigfoot, or the
Finding Bigfoot.
Yeah, Finding Bigfoot.
Exactly, yeah. I think maybe like that pilot episode, yeah. And he was of the mind that he had proven that Bigfoot was a kid in a costume. And I have some friends in the community who think otherwise, but you know, I interviewed him, and he gave me a story that to me was pretty convincing about that. But I've also talked with Matt Pruitt about it, and Matt, you know, has some reservations about concluding that it was, you know, kids in the middle of the night running across the road in a Sasquatch suit.
Well, one of the first reports you took, Russ, wasn't it a West Virginia State Trooper, right?
Yeah, it was. But actually, I was thinking that when Micah was talking, that just here in the last month, I'd taken right outside Charleston, which, you know, Charleston's not that big a town, maybe, you know, 50 or 60,000 people, but we have little town in every hollow because it's so mountainous and hilly. Yeah. And 5 miles, maybe not even 5 miles, maybe 3 miles from downtown, a gentleman that owned a business had seen a Bigfoot crossing an on-ramp, and it was in July, and 5 a.m. And then just recently, within the last few weeks, I got a call from a deputy that July, same month, about 3/4 of a mile away on another road, had seen a Bigfoot going through a trash can. On, I guess trash went Tuesdays at that particular location, and there it was, you know. So I'm assuming it was the same animal, but when you said that, it made me think of how many times that I've talked to deputies and state troopers, and you know, these guys are on the road all the time, many times in isolated areas that you know, people aren't around. They have a sense of, when they're doing it all the time, whether or not it would be reasonable for a person to be out there, you know, in some remote road in Charleston, West Virginia, going through a trash can at 5 and be covered with hair. So it's interesting that way. I mean, I think those are some of the best reports that you get. Those people are trained observers. You know, they're not affected by stress. If one of us saw something, you know, we would maybe be coached through where we could see things. But, you know, these guys are instantly observer, like many of the military people are. And, you know, they're not affected by that stress. And they probably notice things like height and width. And I know that when you were talking earlier about, you know, convicting, you could almost convict that there was such a thing in Bigfoot if you just went by witness testimony. One of the things, the arguments I've always thought is that, you know, I know that humans aren't very good at saying, you know, how tall something is, maybe how far away something is, but certainly they're good enough to see whether or not something was human or non-human. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think the standard has to be a little bit, and you can't always attach that much, you know, because we always hear about witness testimony is so unreliable and whatnot. But, you know, I don't think that you're trying for a murder trial. So, the standard has to be equated a little bit lower, I think.
One might further argue that and again, I don't want to mischaracterize Sasquatch as a monster, but I mean the monstrous appearance of this with comparison to an average human probably leads to some overblown size and height estimates. I think that's entirely possible because this creature otherwise in appearance is completely distinguishable from a regular human.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. And so I think that the extraordinariness of a person seeing this, especially many witnesses who will tell you, before this, I had no interest in Sasquatch. I certainly didn't believe in this big old ape running around out there. And then I saw it and it changed the way I thought about the natural world. When you have that experience and you weren't expecting to see that, and you're in the moment of, oh my gosh, is that really what I think it is? Yeah, naturally a 6.5 foot tall giant bipedal ape is going to look 9 feet tall. And that's not to say that some of these things maybe aren't actually that large, because there are also some very good observers who say, I saw it standing exactly by this tree. I was able to, gauge the height based on the height of this particular branch. Those kind of things happen. But another account that comes to mind, which was brought to my attention recently by Dakota Waddell, my co-host, and we actually recently had Jeff Waldridge, another great Kentucky researcher, on the program recently. But Jeff is also he's current active law enforcement and also is a Sasquatch researcher. So there are some law enforcement officers like Jeff who are active in the field as well. But there was a police officer in California in the 1960s who filed a vivid up-close encounter where he came upon the creature at night. I think it was similarly going through like a trash can or something. He said it was obviously a female. The breasts were evident, and that it kind of lifted its hand and covered its eyes. And this is a classic encounter. I think, again, that maybe Peter Byrne and others had talked about. Maybe John Green covered it in one of his books. I'll have to try and dig up the exact account, and somebody in the listening audience may recall that. But again, this is a law enforcement officer who said, I didn't even think these things existed, but I saw it. I saw it as plain as day, even though it was the middle of the night. It was fully illuminated in my headlights. I had a very clear look at this, and it was unambiguous what it was. So, again, law enforcement on the state and local level, various different federal government employees in various different agencies, and that throughout the United States. And for my own part, I feel that the relic hominoid enigma, although we hear a little less about it in South America, I think it's pretty evident that there is a fairly strong Eurasian component. We go into the Caucasus with a long history of the Almasti, Yeren in China, Yeti in the Himalayas, Yowie in Australia, and even going back to the British Isles and the traditions about the Woodwoses, things like that. You get down into the Pyrenees and the Iberian Peninsula, and you have those Basahaun creature in the Basque tradition. There are traditions all over the world. Heck, get down into Africa, and you've got these little hominoid type creatures, which are not unlike I think they're called the Agogwe in Africa. That's not unlike the indigenous name in the Malay cultures and in Sumatra, Gugu, which we know as Orang Pendek. Nitaewo in Sri Lanka. We could go all around the world, but I mean, when we look at the fossil record, ladies and gentlemen, and we see the diversity of different hominoid types, bipedal and otherwise, throughout the paleoanthropological record, to think that there are maybe one or a couple of different varieties that have persisted, that's not a stretch to me. And the fact that there are people who are employed within government, state and local in the United States who say they've had those experiences, we should take it seriously and seriously look at it.
And in fact, anthropologist recently wrote a book saying that, he thought that maybe there was some in existence presently.
That's Dr. Gregory Forth, and he's writing about the Orang Pendek, I believe you're talking about. Yeah. And again, I haven't read that book yet, but I follow Dr. Forth's work, and I hope you guys maybe can talk to him at some point. I'd love to see an interview with him. We may reach out to him as well, because the more anthropologists, Jeffrey Meldrum has just kind of led that charge for the longest time. Not the only one. There have been others, Roderick Sprague, and of course Grover Krantz, and plenty of others too. And then outside of anthropology, biologists, like the late Dr. John Bendernagel, who I just, adored his research and the eloquence of his writing, if you read his books. But we need more scientists who are seriously getting involved, even if they're skeptical, but they're intrigued enough to look at it. I have friends both in government and also in the sciences who have begun as skeptics and through the kind of testimony provided by some of these government employees and others that I talk about, they have also said, look, you get to a point where it gets increasingly difficult to ignore this kind of testimony. And again, Russ, when we talked with you on the podcast, I mean, I asked you this. I said, of all the people that you talk to, the people who are constantly sharing these stories, and I'm sure, Brad, you get this too, you hear so many of these stories, and you have to come back around at some point to saying, if one is true, we're dealing with a biological reality.
Well, I was on the BFRO flats earlier looking at some reports, and of course you see that number and it's 50-something thousand just with that one large group. Of course, most of them are this or most of them are that or whatever it happens to be. But if you just with that one group threw out 99% or 90% and just kept, I probably have maybe 8 or 10 exceptional cases that I've taken that are, clear daytime sightings by, a forest ranger or a park employee or a state trooper, whatever it happens to be. And there's people that have that many all around the country, and if we just kept those, it would be so compelling. And of course, it only takes that one, right? And then we're on to something.
Well, I always go back to Matt, and I saw Matt do a talk one time we were on an expedition.
Matt Moneymaker,
yes. Mm-hmm. And Matt says, okay, so you're on a jury, you're at a bank robbery trial. Did you as a juror see him rob the bank? No, but we just trotted in 400 witnesses that saw that guy rob the bank. Did he rob the bank? Even though you didn't see him. I got 400 witnesses that said he did rob the bank. Are you going to vote to convict him? Well, yes, we will, because I had 400 good witnesses. And that goes right back to Russ. 10% of 52,000 is 5,200 people. There's 5,200 people. Divide that by 50 people. That's 100 people. Whatever per state that is concrete, perfect witness. These things have to exist.
I'm sorry. I feel like there's a bit of a double standard, though, that we see sometimes where we can accept that in a court of law because it's seemingly unextraordinary circumstances, right?
Sure.
Laws are broken every day. People break the law. Crimes are committed. Okay, that's not outside anybody's, acceptable reality. But when you've got dozens and dozens and dozens of people who come forward with seemingly very credible daylight sightings of an unrecognized anthropoid ape, we need so much more evidence. Why? Because it's extraordinary claims. Okay, I get it. Sure, those are fairly extraordinary claims. But again, I often say to people, with all the popularity of the UAP subject right now, for anyone who's unfamiliar, UFOs, the artists formerly known as UFOs, now thanks to the military's renewed involvement, they call them unidentified aerial phenomena or UAP. But when you look at that subject and you look at how interesting it is, and even though many people are very hesitant to say, well, we're not saying little green men, we're just saying phenomena. Right? Kind of like the, California Fish and Game Department refers to Sasquatch as a phenomena. Okay, cool. Call it what you want. But there are many who are entirely willing to entertain the possibility of extraterrestrial visitation to Earth. These technologies are so far advanced beyond anything we know. There's nothing else it could be. And yet to try and assume that an anthropoid ape unrecognized by science has somehow remained well hidden enough that it has not been recognized as a species, a specimen has not been collected, a type specimen has not been designated. That seems so hard for people to imagine. And I'm like, look at Gigantopithecus blacki, look at Paranthropus, look at instances in the fossil record where we already have potential candidates for what this creature might be. Those things evolutionarily make sense. They have existed already in the past. Why is it so difficult for people to accept the possibility that an as yet undiscovered ape might exist? This one's not that much different from the other extant higher primates that are our cousins, gorillas, chimpanzees, and what have you. It's presumably larger, i.e. like megafaunal, and it's bipedal. But some of the intriguing reports I get, especially from hunters who startle these creatures in the forest, especially here in the Southeast, I do hear these reports, and you guys may have collected some of these, where the animals break down into a quadrupedal or semi-quadrupedal kind of locomotion, where they'll sometimes kind of knuckle run, which is interesting. I've received
Yes.
personally a few reports where that kind of behavior is described. So the point being, I mean, that this sounds like a biological organism, and it's not unlike extant organisms that already exist alongside us here on this planet today, some of which, like the mountain gorilla, were not recognized for quite a while until about maybe the middle of the 19th century. And before that time, what were they? They were the monsters of folklore.
And, you know,
like
we as humans are so arrogant. We have this arrogance about us that says, you know, we know everything. We really do. So if we haven't seen it, we don't have a specimen, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
You know, and of course with the mountain gorilla, they're, you know, now that we've discovered them, you know, they're very slow. They live in this colony up on a mountain. People can go up there and see them. They're always there. With this thing, you know, this thing is a bipedal nomadic creature that, you know, I think we had somebody on a couple our last podcast that said, you know, they're maybe on the 6-day traveling cycle in certain times of the year or whatever that is. And so, like I said, as humans, we're just very arrogant, and we just need to open our minds and say, you know what, maybe we're not the smartest ones out there, you know, just because we make fire and we drive cars. You know, we got these other guys out here, man, they're living on the land and they're staying away from us. So maybe they're smarter than we are.
Yeah, the question is really, how do you define intelligence? I mean, we might argue that they're the more intelligent ones, you know, the ones who don't engage in wars, the ones that don't engage in violence against their fellows, you know, the ones who don't, at least as far as we know, they certainly don't have nuclear proliferation problems like we do.
Right. Exactly. So, Russ, you were going to say something?
Well, you know, going back to the mountain gorillas, remember we think as humans we knew exactly how many there were. You know, we couldn't discover them for the longest time. But then we think we know everything about them. Then just a couple of years ago, they find another group of a couple 100,000, that many that they didn't know even existed, you know, in some remote place. I think that, you know, the government's always well-intentioned, but just like the spotted owl, if anybody recalls the story, you know, they wanted to stop the logging. We're always putting the fires out. And so in the end, the government was responsible for the demise of that bird, because we find out later that it likes secondary growth, which is what we get with logging, with what we get with fire burn, and that's where they nest. And of course, man thinks he knows everything. He doesn't. He's well-intentioned, but, you know, I mean, I could segue right into some of the COVID stuff, but, you know, that's a whole different thing.
Right. Sure. That's another hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
Indeed.
Exactly. So
we know, Micah, thanks so much for coming on. I think that, you know, you're just the person, one of the ones in the country that can bring this out so we can all understand it a little bit better and, you know, stroke some of the finer points for us.
Right. Go ahead and promote yourself for that hour of your time this evening. You get a free plug. Go ahead and do your plugs.
First of all, it's my pleasure to be here to see you again. The good Dr. Russ, and of course, Brad, to make your acquaintance. I hope we'll do this again sometime.
Oh, absolutely.
I always look forward to our conversations, fellas, and also maybe doing some field work on down the road. But if people want to find me, my website is Micah. I guess I've got it right here, right? MicahHanks.com.
Yes.
You can follow me at Micah Hanks on Twitter. And of course, I'm editor-in-chief at thedebrief.org, which is a pretty popular science news site these days, science and defense, and we do cover UAP at that website as well. So in the middle of all my other projects and things I've got going on, I've got that too. So I'm a pretty busy guy. If I'm a little slow getting back to the emails, go easy on me. Sometimes it takes me a few days to get back to messages and things, but I'd be very interested in hearing from anybody out there who may be listening. If you or someone you know has worked in government or has, you know, worked in law enforcement and you've had an experience, info@micahhanks.com is the direct email to reach me. I'd love to hear from you. I'm actively involved in the pursuit of more information about this area of research, Sasquatch and government. I'm producing at least a monograph, maybe a full-length book on it. Hope to have that out by next year, which is going to be kind of a preliminary assessment of this, and I'm sure that this will be ongoing for years.
Well, before you bring the book out, you need to come on the show, and we need to talk about this again, because I'm going to do some more research. And
okay. Yeah.
Like I said, I got my tinfoil hat on all the time, and Russ looks at me funny.
Hey, well, look, again, like I said at the outset, First of all, there are such things as real conspiracies. But what's the old phrase? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't actually after you.
Exactly.
That's exactly right, my friend.
Exactly. All right.
Micah, thanks so much, my friend. We appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great to see you both. And thank you.
Hey,
Until
no
next
problem.
time.
Thank you. All right, Russ, that proves I'm right.
Did? I mean, how
did.
did you come up with that?
It absolutely proved I'm right.
I mean, he literally said everything that I said and that I've been supporting all this length of time.
Right. They're out there, man. They're the black.
Before I forget too, I was like, how did we not? We'd be remiss without mentioning that, one of our presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, told a Bigfoot story. The Bowen encounter where two hunters were, attacked by something and one of the hunters got killed. But so I guess that was probably the most prominent government official so far to tell a Bigfoot story.
Like I said, I was right. Proven.
Wow.
They exist.
I don't think you've got enough sleep, man.
All right.
Let's do this next week and I'll prove you wrong about something else.
All right, that's fine. Whatever. All right. At Wide Open Research on Instagram, wideopenresearch@gmail.com. Send us your stories.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some stories. Love to hear the ones that others don't hear.
Right.
I'll treat you just like my patients. We won't share your name. Everything's in confidence with us. And, love for you to reach out.
Link and subscribe. Click the little button. They always tell us to do that. We're trying to, we want to be number one on the Untold Radio Network, and we got a ways to go. So please help us out with that. Anything else for us? What's your face? Catch Russ on Facebook.
Yeah, on Facebook or Twitter at Bigfoot Doc or the BigfootDoc.com. But I'm active in social media. You can find me out there somewhere. But appreciate everybody, and until next time.
And let's go ahead and get out of here.